Welcome, listeners and viewers to CHP Talks. We're here again this week with Major Russ Cooper. Thank you, Russ, for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you, Rod.
Yeah, and I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction, but I've asked Major Cooper to be with us today because of the situation that has developed over the last week in Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and maybe some of the things behind it. But I've asked Major Cooper because of his military experience, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him before we launch in. He's been a guest on this program before. Major Cooper is the founder, the board chair, the president and CEO of the Canadian Citizens for Charter Rights and Freedoms. That's C3RF. Major Cooper is retired from both the Royal Canadian Air Force and Air Canada. In his military career, he was a decorated CF-18 combat pilot. He served in several staff positions as a director of major capital acquisition projects. In his civilian aviation career, he served as an international airliner pilot with national responsibilities in the field of post 9/11 civil aviation security. And he is published internationally in this latter area. Now he is fully retired, if you can call it that, from his follow-on career as a human factors engineer and a Transport Canada flight test pilot delegate. He is pursuing an abiding interest in the preservation of fundamental Canadian charter rights through the organization he's founded, C3RF. This latter pursuit has been prompted by his sense that these rights, hard won by the sacrifice of Canadians past, are under attack and on the verge of being lost. So again, welcome, Major Cooper, and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks, Rod. As I say, a real pleasure to be with you again.
Yeah. So when I contacted you a few days ago, it's because of this relatively new situation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Seems like we just go from one crisis to the next around here. We just got over the unjust and irrational use of the Emergencies Act to chase a bunch of truckers out of Ottawa. And within hours, within hours of that act being revoked by our prime minister, we saw Russia moving in on Ukraine. And just want to get first of all, your perspective on that whole thing. I'm sure that you have been following that for years, probably the Russia-Ukraine conflict or tension, and now it's broken out into open warfare. So give us your first impressions of what's going on today.
I agree, Rod. It seems like it's just one thing after the other. We have one crisis followed quickly by another one. It reminds me of the old biblical adage that came out of Revelation. So I believe it mentioned the fact that there will be wars and rumors of wars. And
yes,
it goes on to say, hang on, because these things have to happen. This is the way things are going to be laid out in front of us. But we certainly seem to be in a situation where it's never ending. The crises are never ending. The Ukrainian-Russian problem is one that's been long-standing. We've seen it come into focus in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. At that time, the Soviet Union shed some of its Soviet states, republics, Ukraine being one of them. Ukraine became an independent nation in 1992. In August of 1992, they had their Declaration of Independence. And since that time, it's basically been a seesaw battle between basically the western part of the country, Western Ukraine, and their drive to become westernized, join NATO, join the European Union, become a fully Western integrated part of Europe, and then the eastern part of the country of Ukraine, wanting to, which is very much a Russian makeup, Russian population, wanting to stay with Russia on, I guess, familial terms almost. So back and forth, we've seen this conflict. We've seen, in the instance of 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, NATO at that time, I think, to paraphrase NATO at the time, they promised Russia, Gorbachev and Yeltsin at the time that NATO would not expand a centimeter east towards Russia. That was a pretty critical thing for them to say, because it helped the whole process of the Soviet Union shedding itself and becoming the Russian Federation. But since that time, however, there's been a lot of activity on the part of NATO, on the part of the United States of America in particular, to go back on that promise to not advance a centimeter. And they've, on many occasions, instigated in Ukraine to put forward that promise, that carrot of joining NATO. We see in 2004, we had what was called the color revolution, where we had the orange shirts in the streets. We had the protests and the riots, and that was the western part of Ukraine wanting to become westernized, become a member of NATO. And out of that, we had Yushchenko was his name, and he came into power. And from that time until about I guess about 2010 or so, we had some problems, and with Russia seeing that it was being threatened by this seemingly advance of NATO. This has been, as I say, back and forth, and recently under Biden, as late as August of 2021, we had the American administration again put out that carrot in front of Zelensky, the present leader of Ukraine, that NATO was a possibility. And then we see that as these waves of promises come forward and Ukraine starts to orientate itself towards the West, 2014 was a time period when this happened. We see Russia reacting strongly. And 2014, of course, they took over the Crimea, and they started instigating in the Donbass region. And that was a direct result of them feeling threatened over this westernization of Ukraine. And now we're seeing this happen again with Zelensky in 2021 and the prospect of joining NATO. I think Zelensky just a few days ago made a request to the European Union to immediately join the European Union. So we can see that this has been driving Russia's responses, and Russia under Putin has been long on the record of declaring the fact that this is a red line. Ukraine must be, they must see Ukraine as not a security threat. And so they are basically doing what they've been saying for a long time, that they will ensure that Ukraine is on the friendly side of the ledger when it comes to their relationships with Russia.
So the joining the European Union, would that have military implications or strictly economic ones?
Economic primarily. The European Union has talked in the past about having its own armies, standing armies, etc. But basically, the major military alliance there is NATO. NATO, at the time of the Soviet Union being broken up, had so many nations in it. Since that time frame, from then 1991 until now, there are 14 more NATO nations in the alliance, and a lot of them are abutted and close to the Russian Federation.
Wow.
So we see where that Russia has that inkling, that feeling that its security is being compromised by NATO.
So I guess if Ukraine had been a part of NATO at the time of this cross-border attack, it would have been incumbent on NATO countries the expectation would have been military intervention, I guess, from the West.
That's right. NATO alliance, Article 5 of the NATO alliance of the NATO Charter indicates that an attack on one is an attack on all. So if Ukraine was a member of NATO, this incursion would mean, or even the Donbass incursions might mean, the whole of NATO would rise up on Ukraine's behalf and defend it. But it's not a member of NATO, and so that Article 5 does not apply in this particular case.
Yeah. Would you think that possibly the timing of this would be Putin saying, I'm gonna hit while while that Article 5 does not have a bearing on it. In other words, he knew that there would be a slow or measured response from the West. Although even the economic response, I'm kind of surprised how dramatic that's been. The removing of a lot of Russian banks from SWIFT, and the fall of the ruble. I'm not sure where it's at today. I didn't look at it today, but they've certainly taken a major hit that must be troubling Mr. Putin.
Oh, the last I saw was, maybe it was yesterday, it was down 30–40%. So it is crashing. The ruble is crashing. This is not good for Russia, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And but when you talk about timing, I guess this is on the heels of the Biden calamity in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where the Americans left the country with $80–85 billion worth of military equipment, a complete debacle. This is, as you say, Biden was making news with putting that NATO carrot out in front of the Ukrainians, and as you say, if Ukraine joined NATO, that would be a totally different situation for Russia. So we are looking at a window here, where if one is looking at being realistic, we can see that this is probably not that. It's not that unpredictable that Putin would move at this particular time, given these factors. Now, the other thing that you kind of hit upon was the reaction from all the Western nations and other nations around the world, and it's really kind of unprecedented, because what we're seeing everybody coming out and beating the war drums. Everybody wants to give the Ukraine equipment, lethal weapons. Canada's promised anti-tank weaponry just within the last couple of days. So they're shifting from non-lethal to lethal support. Normally in a situation like this, what you would see is countries band together and say, wait a minute, can we talk peace? Can we have an off-ramp here? If this was Israel and Hamas, everybody would want to sit down, let's declare a ceasefire. Let's get our act together and be cool about this thing. We don't want to let this get out of control. But that is not happening now. What's happening now is everybody is feeding the fire, and that is that is very, very interesting, and it makes one wonder why that would be the case.
Yeah, well, I just put out an article today about media bias and the fact that here, even in the West, we do not get real news. Not from the mainstream media. We saw the misrepresentation of the truckers' convoy and the motivation of those who are talking about freedom, want freedom in the West. And I'm sure the same thing is true in the East. And I mean, Pravda, which is supposed to mean truth, the Russian papers and media have not been, they don't have a halo on this issue, on the issue of media bias and truthful reporting. But it sure makes a difference who you're listening to when you look at this conflict here. I've seen several articles that talk about some of the internal conflicts in the Ukraine. It's not like 100% of the Ukrainian people are opposed to the Russian influence, and as you've brought out so very clearly. Do you think? I mean, we've heard same saber rattling in China with Taiwan. Do you think that there is a likelihood that China will move at this time while the world is distracted with Ukraine? Or,
well, if we look at that timing, as we discussed, we've got a weak America. We've got a situation where if anyone's going to make a move, it's probably going to be now.
Yeah.
And so we've seen Putin make his move, and I don't see why Xi, in these particular circumstances, wouldn't think that this was an opportune time for him to make a Taiwan incursion. I really think it would be silly not to think that might not be on Mr. Xi's mind.
Well, there's been fairly recent talks between Putin and Xi, and seems like they have, strengthened their friendship in recent days. There was a period of time when I think Russia and China, in spite of both having communist governments, I think there was a time when they sort of were looking at their own sphere of influence, and they didn't want to be supplanted. Russia didn't want to be supplanted by China, but I think now they're looking at the world in a different light. Of course,
I think so. I think, and now we're seeing the West basically is pushing Russia to ally itself and become closer to China. And we've seen recently an energy deal between the two countries, Russia and China. I think it's a 30-year deal for oil and gas energy going from Russia to China. So we're also seeing some monetary arrangements starting to spring up between the two nations, and maybe even a move to establish a new reserve currency, worldwide reserve currency. So yes, we have a real issue here with, the West is not really playing this as smart as it could, I don't think. And it's kind of silly. It's kind of crazy to see how they're actually stoking the fires and making this situation, if anything, even worse. I want to say that I see parallels here with the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
mm-hmm.
In that instance, the West, NATO had missile batteries in Turkey that Khrushchev at the time saw as a real security threat. So Khrushchev and the Soviets began to install missile systems in Cuba. Now, under the Monroe Doctrine, the American Monroe Doctrine, that was used by the Americans to quarantine and blockade Cuba and keep those missile systems and parts out. And at that particular time, it was readily apparent that the Monroe Doctrine was going to be held fast to, and the Americans were prepared to go nuclear to make its point. So there was a security threat there that the Americans saw as a red line, as an existential threat. And I think that is what we're seeing now with Russia. They see Ukraine going to the West and becoming allied with NATO as a red line and an existential threat. So I think people have to realize that the more we push here, we're really pushing ourselves over the edge of a cliff, because there's no happy solution if we keep poking this particular bear.
Yeah. So Putin has definitely talked about putting his nuclear forces on alert, or on, basically combat readiness. And do you think that, from what you just said, I gather that you think that may not be just talk, that, he might be prepared to use the nuclear option?
This is existential. And Putin has been clear, and he's been clear for many, many years now, that this is a red line for him. He's even warned the West on several occasions that this means everything to the Russian Federation from a security point of view. So I don't think we can not take him at his word. I really don't.
Yeah. No, war is terrible, as we know, as you know very well, and historically, the millions and millions of lives that have been lost in combat over the years. So when Russia crosses the border, like it seems to many in the West, including myself, when we saw the tanks begin to roll and the missiles begin to fire, and that there's people dying, some innocent people or civilians, women and children. It's a tragedy, no matter how you cut it. And I just don't. It's difficult to know how to respond to that. Without, we just want the fighting to end. If you were Prime Minister Trudeau, what direction would you take in terms of Canada's foreign policy? We can't control what President Zelenko does, or President Putin, or President Biden, for that matter, or Xi. But what would you do to try to put some oil on the waters here?
I think I try to do what prime ministers past have done. I think I'd approach this from okay, let's try to work some sort of an off ramp here. We need both sides to come together and reason this out rationally, and have an off ramp that saves face on both sides. Canada has been up until very recently has been pretty good at that. That intermediate power.
Right.
The country that kind of gets people together and let's sit down and have a talk. That's really required at this particular point in time. There are possible solutions. if is it really in the West's interest to have Ukraine join NATO? Is that something that the West is willing to die over? I quite frankly don't think so. I don't see it in our national interest at all, or in the interest of the United States of America. So would that be such a is that something that can't be discussed, around the table between the two parties? So I think what we're doing, what Canada is doing right now, is actually is not within its national character. It's setting a new precedent, stoking fires, and giving ammunition and weaponry to one side over the other. Is really not doing anybody any good. It's going, I think, the wrong way.
If the world were to back up, the Western world were to back up and just, I guess you have to have diplomacy with it. You can't just back away from it. All these arms have been shipped and seen as support. And I understand people wanting to help the people that are, the civilians particularly, that are under attack. You feel like, I think the sense is that, well, if we can give them the arms, we don't actually go in and fight, but we give them the arms so they can defend themselves. But, many people believe that ultimately Russia will prevail there in terms of, the size and strength of their force. But both sides seem to be dug in pretty hard. Now you'd always, when you add this to the mix, that people have lost a brother, they've lost a son, they've lost a father there. And that, builds, the internal hostility towards another people that have caused this. So how do you escape from that? Maybe in general, speak about how people recover from a wartime situation, from a conflict where lives have been lost.
I think when we talk about, it's easy to feel for the Ukrainian people. Their country is being invaded. But I think we also have to look at it from the perspective that, as you said, civilians are going to die, and they're matched up against a pretty powerful modern force. So you have to ask yourself, if you're giving anti-tank weapons to a mother or a wife and telling her to go into the street and take down a tank, what you're doing is you're sending them to their death. Is what you're doing. So I think, as you say, maybe it's easy because you're not doing the fighting, and you're getting someone else to do it, I guess, on their own behalfs. But feeding the fire with that kind of support, I don't think is as altruistic as people would like to think. But go ahead.
If the Russian army conquers Ukraine and establishes, complete control there, I'm sure there would be, street fighting that would go on, and underground, people who were not satisfied with the result, obviously. But do you think then that the Russian army would withdraw, or is there any possibility that it would, if Putin established a victory there, that he would have any temptation to go on beyond Ukraine?
Well, I think, if you look to the recent past of Ukraine, you can see where over the course since 1991, where, as I said, we've had this back and forth between, I guess, leaders in the Ukraine that were pro-Russian and leaders that were pro-West. And over the course of that time period, some, say, 30 odd years, generally speaking, it has been peaceful until Russia gets prodded and it gets poked. Things, day-to-day life goes on, and people live their lives. And I guess you could take a look at the situation of perhaps Finland. When we had the Soviet Union, Finland had an arrangement with the Soviet Union, and the arrangement was that no forces that could be construed as enemies of the Soviet Union would be allowed to have access or operate on Finnish soil. And with that understanding in mind, Finland basically wasn't a totally free country. It was under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, but it did make its own way in the world. And I think you have to when we look at countries like the Ukraine that are well within the sphere of influence of a major power like the Russian Federation, I think you have to take that into account, and maybe a fully westernized life, if NATO as an ally partner, and then the European Union, maybe that has to be tamped down a bit. Maybe it has to be adjusted a bit.
Yeah.
To so that the security worries of the Russian Federation are somehow addressed. I mean, we're not going to. Ukraine isn't going to win anything unless the Russian Federation security interests are somehow taken care of. And I'm afraid what's going to happen as we see more resistance come to play, we see more support going to the Ukrainian people. This is a red line for Russia, and they cannot lose. If it's existential, they cannot lose. So we're just going to see more and more violent measures being taken by the Russian Federation to ensure a win. And I think we're on that path right now. Is what we're seeing. We're seeing the rollout of rocket systems that use explosive air technology, and are absolutely devastating. So we're on a thermobaric weaponry. We're on that path where we're going to see more and more violence.
So shifting topic just a little bit, Russ, with your experience, you were involved in basically, it sounds like procurement on some level with when you were in the Air Force. And where do you see in general, I mean, even putting Ukraine aside for the time being, where do you see Canada's military establishment at the moment? And if you can even touch on our treatment of veterans and maybe that's too big of a topic for you to tie off with, but I'd like to hear your perspective of Canada's armed forces, where we're at, where we should be at, what we should be doing to be best prepared for our role in the world in 2022.
I think it's really important for Canada and its military to be operationally ready. And I'm afraid what I'm seeing now is I'm seeing the Canadian military go down a path where the socio-cultural priorities are taking the headlines, are taking the main thrust of military interest. So rather than concentrate on operational readiness, we're seeing this whole social engineering thing of ensuring that we have diversity, inclusiveness, and equity in the military. We see all these things that kind of take away from a merit-based approach to a military organization. And I think if there's any place where merit-based operations in the military, it's in the military. You've got to have an organization that's based that, you don't lead people unless you have the wherewithal, the leadership abilities, and you merit that kind of a position. We're seeing now that the military is concentrating elsewhere, and it's become politicized to the point where I think it's having a hard time discerning what its operational objectives are. And I think of one instance, and this is crazy, but we had that time period there where the military was actually using psychological operations against the Canadian population. It's using psyops against its own population to shape public opinion when it came to the government's pandemic measures was what they were doing.
Yeah.
So we're totally getting off track. A military that's doing that kind of thing is totally getting away from what it should be doing. It's become politicized to the point where it's operating for the government of the day rather than the people of Canada.
Yeah.
That's extremely worrying. And just on a final note there, when we're poking this bear, we're poking Russia. And basically it's our neighbor. It is our northern neighbor, and it's got a lot of claims on the Arctic, and it's claims that go counter to Canadian national interests. So we're going to poke this bear, and meanwhile we're getting away from a military capability that would allow us to address things like northern operations. It's not in our interest for the military to go down this path.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That sort of ties things up. If there's anything else you want to add, we'll pass this on to our listeners. Russ, it's been very informative. I really appreciate you taking the time, and we may be talking to you again, depending how this conflict develops or if it comes to a near conclusion. We certainly hope that the bloodshed ends soon, but there are these forces that you have mentioned that are kind of implacable. There are things that are set in stone, and when strong leaders see their interests, the interests of their country in a certain light, it's not always easy to turn their mind to another approach. So thank you so much for joining us today. Anything else that you would like to add just before we close?
Just one thing. I'm just casting my mind back to 2008 or so when Barack Obama first got in, and Hillary Clinton, his minister or state secretary of state, had a meeting with Lavrov, the Russian Federation foreign minister, and she presented him with a reset button. And at the time, everybody thought, that this is all about, resetting relationships between the old Soviet Union and America, put everything on a new basis. But I'm thinking now, I mean, this whole thing about reset is we see talk of our own prime minister talking about resetting the economy, having a great reset, having a new Green Deal. Getting away from our traditional strengths and resource development. And so I'm wondering if this whole reset is an idea that Putin and the Russian Federation are not fans of. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's one of the sources, maybe one of the reasons that kind of explains why the West is so adamant to poke this bear, because this bear is not going along with some of the grand schemes that some of our Western leaders are pushing at this point in time. But just a thought.
I agree with you. I think there are undercurrents that we can't see, at least not clearly in our day, social undercurrents, even in what could be gender or economics or other issues that are maybe moving the hearts of leaders in different ways on this issue. So we thank you for giving us some insight into this very complex and troubling situation, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again. And your website, Russ, before we close.
Oh, yeah. That's www.canadiancitizens.org. Take a look at it. We've got a lot of stuff, a lot of content up there that people might be interested in taking a look at.
CanadianCitizens.org. Russ Cooper, thank you very much for joining us today. God bless you, and we'll talk again. Thanks.
Thanks. I look forward to it, Rod. Bye-bye.
Bye.